Hello. So this is the last of my New Year re-releases for January. This is episode 3 of the Imperfect Genius podcast. And similar to the previous episode, this is another one that is essential to the core of the Imperfect Genius mission. In this episode, I'm talking to Dawn Whalen, and we're talking about business ownership. We specifically focus on owning a franchise and talking about franchising versus starting from scratch. But the conversation and the topics about business and getting started in business are what I mean when I say it's essential to the core of the mission at Imperfect Genius. So take a listen, and I hope you enjoy. Welcome to Imperfect Genius, the podcast helping Black women thrive by providing technical advice on effectively navigating the business development journey and advice on building successful careers in the tech industry. I'm your host, Rachel Foster, a tech professional, educator, and entrepreneur. With me today is a longtime friend and former virtual business partner, a term that we totally made up, by the way, Dawn Whalen. Let me tell you a little bit about Dawn. Dawn hails from the northwest corner of Connecticut. She's married with 2 grown children, one who just graduated from college and one who's a junior in college. She has a varied business background in management consulting, event planning, and fundraising with over 10 years in the nonprofit sector as an executive director. Dawn is a certified interim executive leader. Her nonprofit experience includes literary festivals, public arts events, or exhibits, and managing co-working spaces with experience in the affordable housing and substance use disorder spaces. But most notably, for the purposes of today's podcast, Dawn was a franchisee with Computer Explorers for 5 years. Dawn, welcome to the podcast.
Rachel, I am so incredibly happy to be here today with you. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Oh, I'm so happy to have you here. I wanted to have you on this podcast because I was thinking about doing a podcast about franchising. And I was like, who better to talk about franchising with than my former franchise partner?
Oh,
we weren't actually partners. We just sort of we said we were going to be like virtual business partners. And we'll tell a little bit more about that story. In fact, but before we get into our story, let's talk about what is franchising for the listeners, because, this part of this episode, I just want to sort of introduce the concept to our listeners. So I'll say that in the simplest terms, and Dawn, feel free to, correct me if you've got a different definition, but I'd say in the simplest terms that a franchise is basically like a prefab, well-defined, pre-orchestrated business model that can be easily replicated. The most famous franchise in the world is McDonald's, probably. I would guess would be McDonald's.
I'd agree.
And there's a documentary on Ray Kroc, but basically here's what happened. Here's how McDonald's came to be. Ray Kroc stumbled across these McDonald brothers. I don't remember their names. Again, there's a documentary out there on either, I don't know if it's Netflix or Amazon Prime somewhere. It's called Founder, I think. But anyway, so Ray Kroc stumbled across this hamburger stand that was run by these McDonald brothers. And he was like, this is the most well-run, most efficient burger stand that I have ever seen before. And he was like, I could turn this into a product. And when he said this, he meant like this business model. Like I could just turn this out so that there could be a McDonald brothers hamburger stand on every corner. Again, obviously visionary. So that's what he did. He basically noted down all of their processes and how they made their burgers, how they made their fries, how they, took their orders, and just basically turned that entire business model into a thing that he could sell to other people. So now today, if you want to run a burger stand, you can buy a McDonald's franchise if you got enough money. So basically that's what a franchise is. So let's say that, you're a fitness buff and you've always dreamed of owning a Curves, then you can buy a franchise. Or if you're a mechanic, then maybe you buy a Jiffy Lube franchise. That's what a franchise is. Any additional commentary you want to add on that, Dawn, in terms of I
think that, the overall concept is that it's turnkey. It provides you with everything that you need to at least get started.
Yes. That, in fact, turnkey is like an imperative part of the definition. That the idea is that you don't have, you literally get everything you need to start this business. You don't have to figure everything out on your own. So that's what a franchise is.
A little creativity goes a long way, though, as well.
Yeah. True. And I think we'll talk about that a little bit when we talk about some of the pros and cons. But I think it would be helpful for the listeners if we go back a little bit to the beginning, Dawn, and explain how we know each other. And I think you remember the story a little bit better than I do. So do you mind telling the story?
Sure. So I was thinking about this. I know for sure we met in person for the first time at what was called a Discovery Day at the headquarters of the franchise in Houston, Texas. I was purchasing an existing franchise in Hartford County, Connecticut, and you were purchasing a new franchise territory in your home county, Cobb County, Georgia. So I know that was the first time, but I was thinking that now we're going almost 20 years ago. I believe we spoke on the same conference call. This was pre-Zoom, way before any kind of that technology. I think there was sort of a conference call where we were learning about the franchise and about the headquarters and about the parent company and all that. So I think we were on, because when I met you in person, I feel like I already knew you.
So you're saying that like my big mouth guy, like you're like, oh, that's the one who was doing all the talking. Like you're saying I've always talked too much is what you're telling me.
For sure. I was impressed by how much research you did. And I know we're going to talk about that a little bit as well. And then I'm thinking, like, I don't think we went to new owner training together. But we were definitely at some conferences together because they would bring us in to, highlight whatever new product or new curriculum we were going to be introducing. And I remember being in Las Vegas with you.
Okay, I didn't remember Vegas. I remembered the conferences. I didn't remember Vegas. You think you're right about the new owner training, because I think you went to new owner training before I did. Like, I think you were in the cohort right before me, and then I was in the next one because you were buying an existing franchise, and I was starting a new one. And so I think it took me a little bit more time to get to the startup part. So you're right.
I had no time. I needed to
you were like, I gotta go. But speaking of the conferences, I didn't remember we were in Vegas. I do remember the conferences. Do you remember, this is a very vivid memory for me. Do you remember being at one of the conferences? It was the awards ceremony, and they were bringing up all of like the top franchisees and saying what their revenue numbers were and things like that. And we were like, we're going to promise ourselves that we're going to be up there one day. We're going to be up there in 2 years. Like we were setting our goals. Do you remember that?
I believe the term we threw out was the $1 Million Club. We were going to be part of. We were going to start our own level of achievement in the organization.
Yes, because I think at the time, the top was what, 250,000.
There was a ways to go, but it was at a key turning point there when the numbers started going up and business was good. Yeah.
Well, and I think we should tell the listeners a little bit about specifically this franchise that we own. So it was originally called Computer Tots and Computer Explorers, or CTCE. It was founded by Karen Marshall and Mary Rogers in 1994. They were teaching preschoolers, because so the Computer Tots were ages 3 to 5 and Explorers were 5 and up, but we really only did training up through middle school. But, they were doing this training at these preschools, and I think they were in Virginia. I can't remember exactly where they were, but
I think Virginia.
I think it was Virginia. And so they started doing it at multiple preschools. And at some point they decided that they wanted to franchise it. So, go back to my earlier, description of like the McDonald's. Basically, they were like, we're going to turn this into a model that we can then sell to people across the country. And eventually it did become international. So they started it. And they started as a home-based business, and then eventually, sold it to ICED, which I had to look this up, Dawn, because I didn't remember, the International Center for Entrepreneurial Development. And they owned a bunch of different franchises, like Quick Copy and a bunch of like printing and kind of franchises. And they bought Computer Explorers. They also had like Parcel Plus and some other ones like that. So Mary and Karen sold it to ICED. And do you remember Bud? What was Bud's last name? Hadfield?
Hadfield, yes. We each had to meet with him individually, and he couldn't hear very well. So we had to wear these oversized name tags with our first name in like 72-point font so that he could know our name.
Oh, and so he was like the founder of ICED, and we had and we it's so it was such an experience. I mean, just for the listeners, just to give you some visual of just sort of the place where we did our training was a replica of the Alamo. Like there was like 100%. On this cover. It was such an interesting experience.
And they would mostly bring us in the summertime when it was hotter than you know what.
In Texas,
and rainy season, that they would leave umbrellas at each door so you can go between buildings. You just pick an umbrella and hope for the best.
And where you stayed was in a cabin, like a legit cabin, like it because you weren't like it was a compound. You were staying on the compound, and you weren't in a hotel or whatever, and you were staying in a cab, like a literal log cabin. And again, you were going to classes at the Alamo.
And to save money, they would have us have lunch at like 10:30 in the morning because it was cheaper in the cafeteria. Yes. I mean, you can't make up this stuff.
You can't really make this stuff up. It was so, wow. Okay. I think now it would be a good time to take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll talk a little bit about how do you buy a franchise, and then just some of the pros and cons of owning a franchise. Okay, so Dawn, let's talk about how is it that you came to buy your Computer Explorers franchise?
It's an interesting story. So my husband and I were hoping to move back to, we were thinking New England. We weren't sure Boston area or whatnot, from the Virginia, D.C. area. He was in the Navy, and when he got out of the Navy, we ended up outside D.C., but I'm originally from Connecticut, and so the goal was always to get back up towards New England. But before that, I was looking for a mom-friendly part-time job, still while we were living in Virginia. And I had 2 babies at the time. They're not even quite 2 years apart. And so I was looking for something that I could do perhaps while they're at preschool or whatnot. So I was searching and came across this job posting for a technology teacher. And I had done some, technology training in my management consulting days. So making that transition to teaching, I didn't think was going to be that much of a leap. And so I interviewed for the job, and I could start at any time, but then I got curious about, because I learned it was a franchise. And so I got curious about, well, let's see if there's one that might exist in Connecticut. And there were several franchises in Connecticut, and we knew generally where we wanted to live. And so I contacted the franchisee owner that was closest to where we wanted to live, and asked her if she was hiring. And she said, no, but I'm selling the franchise. Are you interested? And pretty much from that day forward, all I could think about was owning my own business and what that could mean for my family, and that it was going to help us achieve our goal of, moving to Connecticut. Of course, my husband, he needed to find a job as well. So all the stars had to align, but it was a very fast process. It was less than, maybe 3 or 4 months.
Wow.
But between me learning about TOTS Computer Explorers and actually moving to Connecticut. It all happened really, really fast. And I think, some reality set in pretty early on, and we can talk about that when we get to the pros and cons. But I think what, I had the wherewithal to at least show it to my friend's dad, who is an accountant, show him the finances.
Yeah.
And he actually wasn't really interested in the opportunity for me. But again, like I said, there was nothing really that was deterring me from. Scott was on board with it. It just seemed like everything was right about it. And the idea of running my own business was like super, super cool. So
Yeah, it's a very compelling idea. I know. It's funny because it sounds like you had a couple of red flags or yellow flags, and you're like, no, I think this is what I think once you
plowed right
decide,
over it.
yeah, exactly. It's fine. It'll be fine.
Fine.
I had the same thing happen to me. So my story about how I bought my franchise is a little bit different. What happened with me was, so I'd been in corporate. You know this story. Emma knows this story. Our producer Emma knows this story. The listeners may or may not have heard this story by this point in time, by the time that they listen to this episode. But I've been working in tech since I was 15 years old. So like I've been in corporate America forever. I don't even remember how old I was at the time. I could do the math right, but I don't feel like doing it right now. But I had been in corporate America forever. I was kind of miserable. And what happened was my mother had passed away years before. And then both my grandparents died 3 months apart, at the year that I decided to buy the franchise. And what happened was with their deaths, I was like, you know what? Life is too short for me to be this miserable in corporate America. I'm going to go do my own thing. And I'd always wanted to own my own business. Like literally when I was 16 years old and I'd written down like my goals for life, like owning a house and owning a business were like number 1 and 2. And then somewhere was getting married and having kids. Like there was like other stuff in there, but it's like, nope, I'm going to buy a house and I'm going to own a business. Like those were like number 1 and 2, you know? So like it had always been a dream of mine to own a business. So I was trying to decide, what did I want to do? Like I had no idea. So I made a list. I made a list of a couple of lists, what I did want to do and what I didn't want to do. And like things on what I didn't want to do is I didn't want to go into an office. I didn't want to wear a suit every day because this was back in the days when people wore suits to work and went into the office. You know, like this was in the early 2000s, right? So, you know, I made a list of that. And then I was like, things that I did want to do. I wanted to work with kids. I wanted to work in education. One of the things that I didn't want to do was I didn't want to completely throw away my tech background. Even though I was miserable in corporate America, I was like, I've got these degrees and all this experience. I don't want to throw that away. So, you know, I definitely wanted a business that had something to do with tech, but I wanted to be in education and work with kids. So I literally took this list and I went to Google, you know what, this is like 20 years ago. Was it? I mean, I know Google existed 20 years ago, but it could have been Ask Jeeves for all I know.
Some search engine.
Yeah, I went to some search engine and I was like, okay, I'm looking for this thing. I'm looking for something that allows me to do the following things and that does not include these other things. And somewhere along the way in that search process, I found Computer Tots and Computer Explorers. I was like, there it is. It's everything I'm looking for. Working with kids, you know, working in technology. Like that was how I made the decision. And
your listeners should know that Rachel is very good at making lists, and she always trusts her lists. Her lists are golden and helped us immensely over the years.
This is true. I am a master list maker. I have lists for my list. I even have like indexes of my lists.
I believe it 100%.
This is true. Okay. So that's how we came to buy our franchise. I want to share a couple of resources with the listeners because those were our journeys to franchising. One of the things, even though, like I said, I went to a search engine and looked up some things. The other thing was I looked up books on franchising. And one of the most helpful books for me was, so these, you know, this is like the analog as opposed to the digital solution, but there was Entrepreneur Magazine had this book called The Ultimate Book of Franchises. And we'll include a link in the show notes so that you can, because it's still available on Amazon. So I went and bought that book. There was another book called The Franchise Bible. I didn't like that one so much, but I literally bought books on buying a franchise. And there's some other sites that exist today that I didn't use back then, but like there's a consumer's guide to buying a franchise that the Federal Trade Commission puts out there. There's a couple of like franchise search websites like Franchise Gator or franchising.com. Entrepreneur Magazine or entrepreneur.com also has like the Franchise 500, the top 500 franchises. So there's a couple of resources that you can use online to try to find a franchise. But like I said, I also bought books on franchising. So I bought books to learn about what it means to buy a franchise. So that's how I learned about, did you remember the UFOC, Dawn, the Uniform Franchise Offering Circular? Do you remember what that?
Yes.
Like this thick book that tells you everything you need to know about the franchise that you're about to buy. Not only, your initial investment, but additional startup costs, your franchise fees, different stuff like that. The important thing, speaking of like ignoring red flags, Dawn, at the back of it, it includes the current franchisees as well as former franchisees, and it includes their contact information. So you can call them up and ask them like, okay, what's it like to, own this franchise? What's the good and what's the bad? So not only did I think I called like 20 current franchisees or whatever, but I called like 10 or 15 former franchises. Like, why don't you own this franchise anymore? What were you like? Why did you leave? And it was so funny because I was so arrogant. But I think it's kind of like what you said, Dawn, like once you got it in your head that you want to own a business, you just want to own a business. Because when I was talking to the former franchisees and they were like telling me the reasons why they weren't they didn't own the franchise anymore, any negative things that they said about the franchise, I was like, oh, I'll solve that by doing this. Like in my head, I didn't say that to them, but in my head, I was like, oh, I'll just solve that by doing that. Like, oh, that's not a big deal. Like I remember,
I remember calling some as well. Plus I had, the person I was purchasing the franchise from, which, and her story was nothing having to do with the franchise itself. She was literally moving. In fact, we swapped. She moved to Virginia. I moved to Connecticut. And it just sort of worked out that way. She, for family reasons, was going back to Virginia. And also I will say for all the research Rachel did, I didn't. And so we were virtual business partners before Rachel even knew it, because I was hanging on every word that she said in that discovery day. I barely listened to the people who own the franchise. I was just listening to Rachel.
Oh, that is so funny. That is so funny. And I think we should talk about how this virtual business partner thing came about. So what happened was there were a lot of the territory. So you would get a territory based on your zip code. So like I was Cobb County in Georgia, and I had like 50 zip codes that were included in my territory. And you might have adjacent franchisees. So like there was another group of franchisees that had the metro Atlanta area. I think those were the only two Georgia, or we were the only two Georgia. But anyway, so you have like these territories, and most of the other territory owners were partners. It was usually like two friends who like bought the business together. But Dawn and I were we weren't the only one, but we were like single franchise owner. We own the territory. We had nobody else to talk to. And so it was like, literally like you have nobody else to talk to. So you're like trying to do marketing and you're trying to, you're like, why am I not getting enough signups and so literally we would just call each other up and go, okay, here's the problem I'm having. I'm trying to sell this one class. It's elementary engineering and I can't get anybody to sign up. Or what do you think about the price point? And so finally, because it might have been at one of the conferences, we were talking about how jealous we were of all the franchisees that had partners. We were like, it's so unfair. Like we're like, well, on the one hand, it's unfair because there's two of them to share the workload and to have bounce ideas off each other. On the other hand, they have to split the money too. We were like, it's like there's the pros and the cons.
Totally. Right? And there were other franchisees in Connecticut. Like we had a little group where we would get together on occasion. But they were sort of already leaps and bounds ahead of where I was. And so when I would ask a question, they would be like, well, it didn't resonate with them because they were so far past that problem. They couldn't even,
right. They're like, I don't remember. That was like 10 years ago when I first started,
So when I would bring the question or the issue or whatever to you, we could talk about it from a frame of, okay, this is new for us. How can we best work through it? So I feel like a lot of the time we try to formalize like, right, once a month or whatever it was, but it ended up being like on the fly most of the time. Yeah. And we got to a place where we would make time for each other, and that was really special.
Yeah. Yeah. And we decided we're business partners. We're virtual, we're not really business partners, but we're virtual business partners.
And so it was share great. My nonprofits with you.
Well, I was going to say, so speaking of, so let's get into that. So like knowing what we know now, let's talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of owning a franchise. I think, I'll start by saying that, now I have the perspective of having bought a franchise and having started a business from scratch. And so like I can compare and contrast the two. And there's challenges and there's opportunities on both sides of the fence. From the franchise perspective, you've got this business model that somebody's already theoretically proven out that this is the way that it works. This is how you sell. This is what your customer looks like. This is how you make money, blah, blah. So like you've got that. You've got marketing. You don't have to worry about creating logos and marketing copy and
Yeah.
trademarking. I've got a I can't even talk. I get so excited. I've got a trademarking, story that is bonus content for the podcast about, my trademark journey for the new business. But anyway, so back to the pros and cons of franchising. So you've got the business model, you've got the marketing, you've got the support from your franchisor. So for us, we were selling classes and we didn't have to write curriculum. Our franchisor would give us the curriculum for those classes. We could tweak it and we could write our own if we wanted, but we didn't have to. But we also had, the franchisee community. We could reach out to other franchisees. Like we just talked about that. But then there's the downside because, it costs a lot of money. You can't just decide I'm going to own a McDonald's unless you've got $1 million. Like, I don't even know what the franchise buy-in cost is for McDonald's, but I think that even the cheapest franchises are maybe $20,000 or $30,000 of like just initial costs. And that doesn't include all of your startup costs. I think for me as I don't remember, I'd have to pull out my old UFOC. I want to say like the UFOC for Computer Explorers might have said like 40,000 or something like that. I don't even remember. But I remember when I talked to my lawyer and my accountant, they were like, you should plan for another $20,000 in startup cost. Like they were like the number that in the book was not what the final number was going to be. Like
did that price include equipment or was that just to buy the franchise? No,
it was to buy the franchise and then it was the training and like literally there was a breakdown of what all that cost was. I think 15 or 20,000 of it was just the franchise fee. And that was the only part you could finance. So like ICED would finance a portion of it for you if you wanted to. Everything else you had to either find your own financing or come out of your pocket. And I did the dumb thing. I spent my own money for everything, which hindsight is 2020. I would never do that again. But, that 40,000, it was like, I think a 15 or 20, I don't remember, for the franchise fee, plus all these like plus training, plus blah, 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 but it did not include equipment. I think it was marketing material, some other stuff, but it didn't include equipment. So that was part of like, I was going to have to spend that money to buy equipment to get started and whatnot. So there's just a lot of costs to start up. But more importantly, I think the biggest negative for me, was the franchise fees. Because here's the thing about those franchise fees. You have to pay it whether you're making money or not. So like you've got these minimums that you're supposed to hit. And don't you even get penalized if you don't hit the minimums? And I'm like, well, if I'm not selling, I don't have any money to pay you in the first place. How are you going to penalize me for not meeting the minimum?
I know.
So like no matter,
give us a break. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So no matter what though, you have to pay those franchise fees. It's it's supposed to be a percentage of your revenue, but there's minimums. Like, so again, I don't even remember what the numbers were, but even if you're not making whatever your target is, you still have to pay a minimum franchise. So you could almost be in the hole because you owe money, even though you haven't made any money, so like you're just losing money. So that was a downside. And then I'll flip and say the other side of it. And then Dawn, I'll let you weigh in terms of your thoughts on pros and cons, but, I will contrast that with starting a business from scratch. Again, pros and cons. The downside is you're starting from scratch. So you literally have to create everything. Like, it's just like everything. It's like, oh man, I got to do that. And then I got to do that. So there's like, you're just having to start and create everything from scratch. Then, there's just you, there's nobody, there is no franchisor to, support. There's no additional franchisee. There's nobody else. It's just like you're going to sink or swim on your own, unless you've got wonderful people like assistant producer Emma who are helping you out, or friends like Dawn who want to come onto your podcast and have a, meaningful business conversation with you. So, but it's still, everything falls on your shoulder. You don't have a lot of support. On the upside though, you don't have to have that big outlay of cost because if you're starting from scratch, you're bootstrapping, you can decide like you do as much as you can afford to do until you can afford to do more, so that's an upside. And then, also it's your own vision. Like you can make it whatever you want it to be. You don't have to fit, because franchises, you have to do things a certain way. You can't decide that you don't like the yellow and orange of McDonald's and you want to use blue and red. No, that's not allowed. So you have the vision to be able to make the thing what you want. And honestly, being a creator is fun. Like creating things from scratch is fun. I was telling Emma and another podcast guest that I'm like basically living in my own Hallmark Christmas movie at this point in time. Like I'm like, oh, I get to create all these things. I'm having so much fun. So like those are like the pros and cons for me of franchising versus starting from scratch. But Dawn, what are your thoughts?
Well, and I just want to add to that, in starting the Imperfect Genius, even though it's brand new, you are starting from experience.
True.
You are starting from a place that you have those years of as a franchisee, even though it's a totally different business model, you know what are some of the pitfalls already, and you can probably head them off at the pass. And,
true. That's true.
And not make the same mistakes. But, you know,
let's hope.
Yeah. We always, yes.
Yeah.
You are, it's going to be 100% successful. I know it for sure.
Thank you.
But, you know, for me, the good part was, again, I had young children. So the idea was this is supposed to be a mom friendly, you know, enterprise that I could keep, you know, business hours while they were in school. I had all the tools and resources at my disposal. Buying an existing franchise, it came with all of the equipment, at least to start. And so probably comparable in price from the initial franchise fee or franchise purchase fee plus equipment, we were probably in at about the same amount. It's just I had everything up front. I found the marketing pieces so helpful because you didn't have to think about what an advertisement for a teacher needed to look like. That piece was very helpful. And then, you know, having you there as a virtual partner for sure was a total upside. There were times that I was like, oh, forget it. I would call her, and she would talk me off the ledge, or I would talk her off the ledge. It's because running a business is hard. It really
Very
is
hard.
And you learn a lot about your capacity and so, you know, part of maybe the bad part of it wasn't ugly, but it was challenging, was having part-time staff who for which your business was their side gig. Yeah. I had a lot of teachers who, they were teachers during the day and then taught after school classes for me or in the summer. So, you know, a lot of the times I was not their priority. And, you know, you really had to set some boundaries, for communication, response time and things like that. And so that became a bit of a challenge. And I lived a bit west of my territory. And at the outset, it didn't seem like a big deal, but it was, because there weren't very many teachers willing to drive out to my house for training. So I would often have to do training at their homes, which meant I had to pack everything up and go on the road, or rent a place, you know, or find a place that'll let us, you know, library or whatever that has a conference room. And then, you know, it was hard to keep up with the technology. I think this is a unique franchise in that you had to definitely change with the times. And sort of when I realized, I'll share a quick story. The recession had hit in 2008. And I think we both experienced loss of contracts. You know, I always describe it as, you know, we were the extra in schools. If there are any parents out there, you know, the extras that
like chess club and Gymboree or what, you know, whatever, the tumble bus and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
All of that. The gym thing, Gymboree thing, whatever it was called. So we were kind of the first to go when school budgets started to get cut. And, you know, we talked about that franchise fees, owing those regardless. It very quickly, I described my business became a bill. It was a bill I had to pay every month, whether or not I had any revenue coming in. I tried to hang on through, you know, I made it to, I think, 2010, 2011. I prided myself initially early on in 2008 that I did not lay off any teachers. I kept all my staff. I thought I was doing the right things. I was making cuts in other areas. But the deciding factor, the day that I came home and said, I'm done, was the day I went to this preschool It was a new contract. I somehow managed to get it. And I brought in my clunky old Dell laptop. Got all these little 3 and 4-year-olds sitting in a circle, which is like a feat of like, Herculean effort to get them to want to all sit at the same time.
Right.
The challenge. And so I held up the laptop and I said, so kids, have any of you ever used a laptop before, a computer? And their responses were this. I use my dad's iPhone. I use my mom's iPad. I use the this, the that. And I was like, that's it. I'm out. I did not have anything. Like there was nothing in my inventory. And I realized I was like, technology is moving too fast. It's changing too fast. And I can't keep up with that. And I'm going to be bringing in class materials and equipment for things kids they've outgrown years ago. Yeah. And so, it was then that I decided that was the ugly,
the business. No, that's true. Yeah. That's true. I want to comment on 2 of the things that you talked about there, the part-time employees and the recession and the business being a bill. So I think that was one of the hardest things for me in the business, because the nature of our business, every employee was going to be part-time. There was never going to be anybody who was going to be a full-time employee, just because of the way that the model was. Like, even if we had these things called whole school contract. We would do after school classes. So of course those were part-time, but we would do whole school contract. And I had a whole school contract with Cobb County Schools, which was a big get, but I'm still only so I had a teacher who was going and basically, just like kids rotate through like music class or gym class, they would rotate through computer class. And my teacher was doing that. But it's still not a 40-hour-a-week gig. It's not 40 hours a week. I think she may have been working 25 or 30. I don't even remember how many hours, but it was still not, there was never going to be a full-time thing. So when you have a business that is dependent 100% on part-time employees, it's really tough, because a lot of people just viewed it as transitory. Like, I'm just doing this until I find my next corporate gig or my next thing. And so the turnover, you were constantly having to hire and retrain, and you're having all this turnover in these schools where there's no consistency. Like, they're used to they want to see the same teacher coming every week. Like, they don't want to see you change teachers every 3 months or whatnot. And so it took me a while to figure out that my best hires were retired teachers, because they were retired and, they liked teaching. They wanted to get back into it, but, they didn't want full time. But the downside of that is a lot of retired teachers were retired because they left because they were same thing, like technology. Like, I don't want to have to keep up with technology. So it was like my best hires would have been retired teachers, but then they also didn't want to learn technology. So that was really rough. And then there was also the times when I will never forget, again, this whole school contract I had. I am sitting, I'm working on the books. I'm doing bookkeeping. I'm doing whatever. I'm sitting in my home office. I get a call from the principal of this school. And again, this is a whole school contract where we're supposed to be there, teaching classes all day. And the principal calls and is like, yeah, I've got a computer lab full of students and your teacher's not here. I was like, I will be right there. Luckily, they were 10 minutes of the school was 10 minutes away from me. And I was like, I literally dropped everything and ran over to the school to go teach that day. And it wasn't until later, and the teacher never called me and told me. And later, when I reached out to her, she's like, oh yeah, I had a flat tire. I'm like, you didn't think to call me and tell me? like there's literally a room full of kids waiting for you to show up and teach a class. But again, like you say, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that you had to, you were the face, they were your face and voice when you weren't there, but the minute they weren't there, you were on. Yeah. And you had a contract to fulfill. I think on the flip side, I'm thinking about, what if any of our franchise leaders listen to this podcast someday? What are some of the good things we can say too? We didn't have to write curriculum. It was ready for us. That made teacher prep a whole lot easier. For the ones who were doing those during the day school programs. All of that was turnkey. It was.
It's true.
And the potential was there. Circumstances, I think, when the organization, when the franchise was created back, what did you say, in the 90s?
I think it was 1994.
80s, 94. Yeah. I mean, nobody had home computers.
Right.
It was brilliant. The whole
Yeah.
concept was brilliant. And there are still franchisees that exist today.
Yeah.
That,
Yeah.
I don't think they sell new franchises anymore, at least in
Yeah.
the
I don't think they do.
US.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
I think they're
there
just
are
international.
still,
Yeah.
and it's some of the original owners
Yeah. Yeah. I
from
know.
way, way, way back. And
Yeah.
so, I think timing and circumstance. And so I wanted to make note to spend just a minute or two on like when you buy a franchise, understanding your territory. Who are you serving? Who is going to be your customer base? And for me, and maybe for you too, I had sort of a mixed, I had some very affluent towns that were hard for me to get into because they're like, well, we own all of this, our kids, we do all this. But then there were some inner city towns, inner cities that I had in my territory, and they were grateful for our programs. Like, they're like, please, can we have all of them? And so it was a balance of trying to, give them what they needed and what I could actually provide. And so, even if it's a McDonald's or whatever, knowing what your demographic is and where you're going to be pulling your customer base for certainly needs to be, a priority.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because,
I know.
hindsight is 2020, right? I was
Yeah.
thinking like, oh, great, I got all these rich towns in my territory. They're going to just buy up these contracts. It was the exact opposite. They didn't really want anything to do with me, but it was the towns where the resources are stretched, where they were grateful for our types of programs.
I also figured out that my best customers were techies. Basically, people who understood the value of their kids learning tech properly. And I stress properly because kids will learn tech no matter what, but learning the right way to do things. They would understand the value of it, but they knew they didn't have the time to teach it to them. So they're like, oh no, this is great. They need to know this. You teach it to them. So like those I found were my best customers.
Totally.
And my worst customers were the ones who were the parents who were afraid of technology. And they're like, well, I don't really know, my kid knows more about this than I do. And I'm like, yeah, but that doesn't mean that they know the right way to do things. This was one of my famous sales pitches was if I'm doing like, say, a word processing class for after school, I'd get these parents like, and I'm doing it like for third graders. My kid already knows everything there is to know about Microsoft Word. What are you going to teach them in this class? And I'd say, okay, well, we do project-based learning. So we're going to learn how to do a newsletter this semester. And so they're going to learn how to do multi-column text. They're going to learn how to wrap text around graphics. They're going to do headers and footers. And I would go on about all these things. And by the time I was done, the parent would go, wow, can I take that class? I don't know how to do that. I'm like, I know you don't know how to do that. That's why I'm teaching the class. I'm like, I'm going to teach your third grader how to do that. And I'm like, this is why you need to sign up for my class. But again, if I would tell just a techie parent, hey, we're going to be teaching word processing to your third grader, they go, great. Yes, you do that because I don't have time to teach them. Right. It was you're right. Like understanding your demographic. I agree with that. The other thing I wanted to say, you were talking about like, if our franchise leaders are listening to this podcast later, things that, to say back to them in terms of positive and whatnot. I will say that the recession was not their fault. Like both you and I left franchise because the recession hit and it wiped us out. It wiped out contracts. It wiped out revenue. That was in no way their fault. And, it
totally.
And they were very supportive. Like they did everything they could to support us, but that's just something that nobody could have planned for. Like that's the reason that we went out of business. It was not because the franchise failed us. Right. It was because the entire world was imploding.
And they really cared. They did. They really cared to the point where they brought me on to write newsletters for them and articles. Like they were paying me, to kind of keep going while, things were kind of struggling. So they really did care. And it was a family in that sense. I think, I always remind my children that I was their first technology teacher, even though they've far surpassed me. But one other thing to think about when you want to buy a franchise is really having a realistic look at the time commitment. Because even though I wanted and more or less kept a mom's schedule, I know for sure I left opportunities on the table because, I just couldn't, I wasn't able, and it wasn't in a position to do all of that and just, leave them in daycare 72 hours a week. It was, so know where you are in your life, what season of life you're in, and where can you make those commitments and be realistic about, do you want to be writing proposals at 11 o'clock at night? Because that's a lot of what I did. I would go back to work after they went to bed. So
yeah.
Even though it was in my house, we all know now the whole blurred line between work from home. We know that.
Right.
We've, the pandemic highlighted that in bold. But back then we're like, oh yeah, I can just go back to my office and work for another 3 hours. No problem.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's very true. That's very true. Wow. I feel like we've given the listeners a lot to think about, and we could go on for hours. I mean, I know for a fact, we could go on for hours, but I say, let's wrap things up here, and we'll plan to have some follow-up conversations in future episodes, because maybe we'll get some voicemails with some questions about franchising or again, like there's many other things. I know, Dawn, you and I could go on and we could talk about sales. We could talk about marketing. We could talk about hiring and training. Like there's so many things we could go on, but let's end it here. Let's end our introductory conversation here and wrap things up. So, Dawn, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation.
You're welcome. I'm so happy to have been here.
I really appreciate it. And to the listeners, we hope that you've discovered some valuable information that might be beneficial to you in your entrepreneurship journey. As always, we want to thank you for listening. Visit subscribe.imperfectgenius.com to subscribe to our newsletter and receive a copy of our show notes. Leave us a voicemail at 404-425-9862 and you may hear an answer to your question on a future podcast episode. You can follow us on social media at Ask Imperfect Genius. And until next time, I am Rachel Foster, reminding you that your journey may not be flawless, but it can be phenomenal. We gotta stay